Okay, let's dive straight in. That little inner voice, the feeling you get when something just feels right or terribly wrong, it's a mystery, isn't it?
It really is.
This whole idea of conscience. Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the core of what conscience is.
Yeah, and we've pulled together a really wide range of material. I mean, everything from ancient spiritual texts to, the latest in brain science.
Exactly. Our goal.
Yeah.
To cut through the complexity, basically, and bring you the most important, maybe surprising and thought-provoking insights about conscience.
What's fascinating from the outset is just how many different angles people have approached this. It's religious beliefs spanning millennia, philosophical arguments debated for centuries.
How do our legal systems grapple with it?
Right, what psychology and even neuroscience are uncovering, and how artists have tried to capture this inner experience. It truly underscores how central conscience is to being human.
Totally. And for you, our listener, someone who's interested in getting a solid understanding without endless hours of research, think of this as your shortcut.
We're aiming for those moments where things click, those unexpected connections that make you go, aha.
Yeah. So get ready to explore this from all sides. We've promised to keep it engaging and skip the textbook stuff.
Right from the start, it's worth noting that while everyone talks about conscience, pinning down a single definition is, surprisingly difficult.
Which is part of the fun, maybe.
Exactly. But that's part of what makes this so interesting. By looking at these diverse perspectives, we can start to piece together a richer, more nuanced understanding of what this inner voice really is and why it carries so much weight.
All right, so where do we even begin to unravel this? Well, for many throughout history, the answers have been sought in their faith. What do religious traditions tell us about conscience?
Well, across many religious views, conscience is fundamentally linked to our understanding of morality. It's often seen as a kind of built-in compass, guiding us towards what's right and away from what's wrong, perhaps as a reflection of a benevolent universe or even a spark of the divine within us.
So it's like we're born with this moral sense, according to many faiths. That's the idea.
That's often the core idea, yeah. Take the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, and the Bhagavad Gita, foundational texts in Hinduism. They describe conscience as a form of knowledge, specifically, the knowledge of good and evil.
Okay.
That we accumulate through our actions, our karma, over many lifetimes. Now, Adi Shankara adds a fascinating twist here.
Oh.
He suggests that while doing what's morally right, purifies our hearts and brings us peace, it doesn't directly reveal the ultimate truth of reality. For that, you need deeper spiritual insight, realization.
Okay, so good deeds are crucial, but they're not the final destination in those traditions. Makes sense. What about other faiths? How does Zoroastrianism, for example, view conscience?
In Zoroastrianism, conscience plays a pretty dramatic role in the afterlife. After death, individuals face judgment at the bridge of the separator.
The bridge of the separator. Wow.
Yeah. And for those who have lived wickedly, denied their higher nature, their conscience acts almost as a tormentor, leading them to a grim fate in the house of the lie.
Yikes. That sounds like a very direct and powerful consequence tied to one's conscience.
Yeah.
What about the philosophies of China, like Confucianism and Taoism? How does conscience fit in there?
The Chinese concept of Ren is really central. It's about benevolence, humaneness, that kind of inner goodness that guides our social interactions, our relationships.
Okay.
Conscience, in this context, is closely tied to adhering to proper social etiquette and striving to live in accordance with the Tao, or the way, that natural order and harmony that reflects inherent human goodness. It's less about divine judgment and more about living in alignment with this universal flow.
So it's about maintaining harmony within oneself and with society, guided by this inner sense of what's right.
Got it. Now, Buddhism also places a huge emphasis on inner peace and mindfulness. What's the Buddhist take on conscience? Buddha connected conscience directly to a pure heart and a calm mind. He actually saw it as a powerful spiritual force, even calling it a guardian of the world.
The guardian of the world. That's striking.
Isn't it? It's deeply intertwined with compassion, leading to what Buddhists call right mindfulness and contemplative practices. The Buddhist scholar Santideva emphasized that perfecting virtues like generosity and patience is a key manifestation of this awakened conscience. So in Buddhism, it's an active spiritual capacity that we cultivate.
It sounds like it's seen as a fundamental force for good, something to be actively worked on. Now, shifting gears a bit to the West, what about ancient Greek and Roman thought? Did they have a similar understanding?
Well, Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, certainly grappled with this. In his meditations, he viewed conscience as our innate capacity to live by rational principles.
Rational principles, okay.
He believed that aligning our actions with the natural order of our own minds and, by extension, the universe, was key. For him, true fulfillment came from an unblemished character and selfless acts driven by this inner rational capacity. So less about divine command and more about living in accordance with reason and, cosmic harmony.
So a focus on reason and aligning ourselves with the natural order of things.
Now let's move into the Abrahamic religion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Let's start with Islam. How is conscience understood in that tradition?
In Islam, the Quran stresses the importance of knowing and understanding one another. A key concept is taqwa, often translated as piety or God consciousness, and it's the noblest among us who possess this quality. Islamic theologians like Al-Ghazali emphasize that while God is ultimately in control, humans have been granted free will and are accountable for their choices.
Right, free will and responsibility. Exactly. Conscience is seen as a very personal and dynamic connection to God, something that's strengthened through piety and good deeds, and, conversely, can become clouded by sin. The work of scholar Marshall Hodgson also explores this connection within Islamic history and culture.
So in Islam, our actions have a direct impact on the clarity and strength of our conscience, our connection to God. Makes sense. Now, Christianity has a very rich and, let's say, sometimes complex history with the idea of conscience. Where do we even begin to unpack that?
Well, the Protestant Reformation really put conscience center stage in Christian thought. Martin Luther's famous stand at the Diet of Worms.
Oh, yeah. The Here I Stand moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Where he declared his conscience was captive to the word of God. That was pivotal. He viewed conscience primarily in the ethical realm. John Calvin, another key figure, saw conscience as an internal battleground where we wrestle with our moral obligations.
Captive to the word of God. That's a powerful statement about where the ultimate authority lies in that view. And a battleground that really captures that sense of inner conflict we often associate with conscience.
It does, doesn't it? For many Christians, following one's conscience is considered paramount, even when it conflicts with human authority. They often cite passages like Romans 2.15, which talks about conscience bearing witness to the law written in our hearts.
Right.
And this has led to significant historical clashes, like the conflict between William Tyndale and Thomas More over translating the Bible into English. It raised that fundamental dilemma. Do you obey the dictates of the church or state, or do you follow your inner conviction guided by your faith?
Those were incredibly high-stakes decisions individuals faced back then. What about different Christian denominations today? Do they tend to emphasize different aspects of conscience?
Some contemporary Christian churches place a strong emphasis on the Ten Commandments or the teachings of Jesus as the ultimate guide for conscience. It's interesting, though, the actual word conscience doesn't appear in the original Greek New Testament.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. But the concept is definitely present. You see it in stories like Jesus' interaction with the adulterous woman, or the parable of the Good Samaritan, where actions are clearly driven by what we would now recognize as conscience.
Right. The underlying moral imperative is definitely there, even if the specific terminology wasn't used then. Now, let's turn to Catholic theology. They often have very detailed and systematic approaches to theological concepts. How do they view conscience?
Catholic theology sees conscience as the most fundamental and practical judgment of reason that directs us to do good and avoid evil. The Second Vatican Council described it beautifully as the law which God has written in the hearts of men, our most secret core and sanctuary where we are alone with God whose voice echoes in our depth.
Wow, that's quite poetic. So it's not just a feeling.
No, not just a passive feeling. It's seen as a very active and discerning faculty. They use the idea of a moral syllogism, where general moral principles are applied to specific situations.
A moral syllogism.
Yeah.
Like logic applied to morality.
Kind of, yeah. And Catholics are taught to actively form their conscience through education, self-examination, prayer, and to act according to it in freedom, particularly in matters of faith. However, and this is important, this doesn't mean individuals can just arbitrarily disagree with established church teaching.
Ah, okay, so there's a framework.
Right. Catholic theology also distinguishes between an invincibly erroneous conscience, where someone sincerely believes something wrong is right without fault,
Okay.
and a vincibly erroneous conscience where the error could and should have been avoided through reasonable diligence. These distinctions have implications for moral culpability, blame. So Thomas More, again, stands as a powerful example of someone who followed his conscience to martyrdom within this tradition.
That idea of actively forming your conscience through learning and reflection is a key takeaway, isn't it? It's not just an innate sense, it requires cultivation.
Absolutely. And Cardinal John Henry Newman further contributed to this understanding. He distinguished between a sense of duty and a moral sense as two interconnected aspects of conscience.
Sense of duty and moral sense.
Yeah. And he famously said he would toast the Pope, certainly, but he would toast conscience first, underscoring its ultimate importance.
That's a striking image, the primacy of conscience, even within a hierarchical religious structure.
Wow. Now, what about Judaism? Does it have a similar framework for authority and individual conscience?
Judaism presents a somewhat different picture, maybe with more potential flexibility regarding religious authority. There's a historical argument that rabbinic leaders have, at times, found ways to navigate laws they deemed unconscionable.
Interesting.
While the concept of a shared destiny for the Jewish people is crucial, thinkers like Moses Mendelssohn emphasize conscience as a form of personal revelation that exists alongside tradition. Similarly, the inner light, valued in Quakerism, strongly resonates with this idea of individual conscience as a direct source of moral guidance.
The inner light.
Even within Freemasonry, symbols like the square and compasses are used to represent aligning one's actions with conscience and circumscribing one's desires. So perhaps more emphasis on that personal inner guidance alongside established traditions and laws in some cases. It's fascinating to see how these different spiritual paths approach this core human capacity.
It really is. And as the historian Manning Clark observed, conscience can be both a source of comfort and a catalyst for our search for meaning, for grace. Leo Tolstoy, though maybe not strictly within a traditional religious framework later in life, strongly believed in the power of individual spiritual truth, accessed through reason and conscience as a means to resist evil.
Right.
And it's important to remember that many of these religious thinkers, Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, Aquinas, Butler, Bonhoeffer, were also deeply engaged with the philosophical dimensions of conscience.
Absolutely. The lines definitely blur.
Okay,
so now let's turn our attention to secular perspective. How do those who don't necessarily adhere to religious beliefs understand the nature of conscience?
Right. Secular views draw from a really wide range of fields: psychology, physiology, sociology, humanitarianism, and even in some darker interpretations, authority.
Okay, quite a mix. Let's start with psychology.
In psychology, you have figures like Lawrence Kohlberg, who proposed a theory of moral development. His idea of a critical conscience represents a higher stage of moral reasoning. Erik Erikson placed the development of conscience within the preschool years as children internalize societal norms.
So early childhood is key there.
Seems to be. And Martha Stout, drawing on emotional psychology, sees conscience as fundamentally rooted in our emotional attachments and the obligations that arise from them, like we feel responsible for those we care about.
That makes intuitive sense. What about Sigmund Freud? He always has an interesting, if sometimes controversial, take on things.
Oh, definitely. Freud viewed conscience, or the superego, in his terms, as emerging from civilization's need to suppress our primal aggressive instincts.
The superego.
This redirected aggression, he argued, forms that internal voice of morality we often associate. When we violate the superego's dictate, often shaped by parental, we experience guilt. Freud even linked neurosis development to this internal conflict resulting guilt.
Classic Freudian theory. So in his view, conscience is almost like an internalized set of societal pressures leading to guilt when we step out of line. What about more contemporary psychological or neurological understanding?
Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist and psychologist, sees conscience as a more evolved aspect of our conscience. It extends beyond basic survival instincts to incorporate our pursuit of truth, justice, our ideals.
So a higher level function.
Right. And Michel Gladier goes even further, proposing that conscience is a fundamental instinct that has enabled humans to form complex societies by fostering cooperation and inhibiting harmful behavior.
An instinct for society that's fascinating. It really highlights the social function of conscience. And speaking of our social nature, what does evolutionary biology have to tell us about the origin?
Well, Charles Darwin himself explored this. He believed that conscience evolved as a way to resolve conflicts between our immediate selfish impulses and our longer-term social needs.
Survival of the group.
Kind of, yeah. He argued that social instincts, which promote cooperation and group cohesion, ultimately have a stronger influence on survival. Behaviors that are destructive to the group, therefore, come to be seen as evil, and conscience arises from our desire to avoid the negative social consequence, the fear or contempt of others, which we experience internally as guilt and shame.
So guilt and shame are like internal alarms for social disapproval.
That's one way to look at it. And a crucial element here, Darwin noted, is the capacity to imagine oneself in another's position, to see things from their perspective. This capacity is often lacking in individuals with certain personality disorders like psychopathy or sociopathy.
Right, the empathy deficit. Yeah. So from an evolutionary perspective, conscience is tied to our survival as a social species. It's about what benefits the group, ultimately benefiting the individual too.
Precisely. This evolutionary understanding can also shed light on broader social phenomena. Nationalism, for instance, can invoke a sense of collective conscience to suppress internal dissent. The ideal of a universal brotherhood of man similarly aims to expand the scope of our moral considerations to reduce international conflicts.
But these collective consciences can sometimes override individual moral judgments, right?
Exactly. That's the danger. Nietzsche, with his focus on the individual will, even saw strong individual drives as potentially clashing with communal solidarity.
That tension between individual conscience and the demands of the group or society seems to be a recurring theme. And sadly, history offers some very disturbing examples of how conscience can be suppressed or even perverted on a societal level.
Absolutely. Hannah Arendt's analysis of Adolf Eichmann during his trial is just chilling.
The banality of evil.
Right. She observed that Eichmann, and seemingly many others involved in the Holocaust, appeared to have lost their capacity for independent moral judgment. It wasn't necessarily a complete absence of conscience, but rather a conscience that had become so deeply embedded within the norms and directives of the Nazi regime that it no longer offered any internal resistance to horrific acts. The respectable society around them essentially normalized the unthinkable.
That's terrifying.
And Jeremy Bentham also warned about how fervent ideologies, fanaticism, can hijack and manipulate individual conscience for their own ends.
The power of the social and political environment to shape or silence conscience is a really sobering thought. Now, before we move into philosophical perspectives, are there any other secular angles we should touch on? Maybe in science.
Yes, definitely. Research in animal behavior keeps uncovering fascinating parallels, suggesting precursors to conscience in other species.
Like what?
Well, we see examples of helping behavior, reconciliation after conflict, empathy in primates, even behaviors that look like guilt in dogs, or evidence of social learning about fairness in birds like magpies. It hints at the evolutionary roots of these moral capacities.
Wow. So maybe it's not exclusively human.
The building blocks might not be, no. And neuroscience is actively investigating the biological underpinning. Studies have shown that damage to the anterior prefrontal cortex,
The front part of the brain.
right, a region involved in decision-making and social behavior, damage there can lead to reduced inhibitions and significant behavioral changes. Interestingly, the effects can differ depending on whether the damage occurs in adulthood or during childhood development.
Huh.
There have even been attempts, like those by Benjamin Libet, to try and pinpoint the neural activity associated with the veto of conscience that moment we decide not to do something. And looking ahead, Jacques Petra has even proposed developing artificial conscience in AI systems to ensure they operate ethically.
Artificial conscience. That's a whole other can of worms.
Okay.
So, from animal behavior to brain mapping to AI ethics, the secular exploration of conscience is incredibly diverse and constantly evolving. Now let's delve into the realm of philosophy. The word conscience itself has Latin origins, right?
Yes, exactly. It comes from the Latin word conscientia. It carries the meaning of privity of knowledge, or maybe more simply, with knowledge.
With knowledge, okay.
Philosophically, this points to an internal awareness of moral standards and consciousness of our own actions in relation to those standards. Often our initial experience of conscience is that gut feeling, or a vague sense of guilt.
Yeah, that feeling.
What we might call traditional conscience. This can be heavily influenced by how we've been raised, the societal norms we've internalized, maybe even indoctrination. Philosophers often contrast this with critical conscience, which involves the active application of reason and our moral convictions to specific situations. It's more of a deliberate, thought-out process.
So that initial feeling isn't always the result of careful moral reasoning. The critical conscience sounds more like what we strive for, perhaps.
Many philosophers would argue so, yes. Medieval philosophy introduced the concept of synderesis.
Synderesis, that's a new one.
Think of it as that initial, almost intuitive spark within us that directs us towards goodness, a fundamental inclination to do right. Similarly, in Sufism, there's the idea of marifa, a kind of intuitive spiritual knowledge that aids in developing a critical conscience in those who are morally.
So an intuitive moral spark. Mm-hmm. It suggests maybe there's more to conscience than just learned behavior or societal conditioning.
Exactly. Many philosophers have explored this interplay between intuition and reason. Avicenna, the influential Persian philosopher, even devised a sensory deprivation thought experiment to try and isolate the core of consciousness and its potential link to a sense of the divine, hinting at a fundamental moral awareness.
A thought experiment.
Medieval Christian thinkers like Bonaventure made a distinction between rational conscience and this more intuitive synderesis. Later, early modern Protestant theologians like William Perkins and William Ames developed a more syllogistic understanding of conscience, applying logical reasoning to moral principles.
So A move towards a more structured, rational approach in some philosophical traditions. What about someone like Thomas Aquinas? He bridged medieval and early modern thought, didn't he? How did he see conscience?
Aquinas viewed conscience as the practical application of our moral knowledge that he believed was ultimately derived from synderesis and the natural law.
Natural law.
Right. He saw conscience as the faculty that judges particular action, noting that selfishness and other vices can often obscure this judgment. He also discussed the crucial relationship between conscience and the virtue of prudence, the ability to make wise, practical decisions in everyday life.
So for Aquinas, it's a process, moving from that inherent sense of goodness, synderesis, to applying it wisely, prudence, in specific situations via conscience. What about the more mystical or devotional traditions within Christianity? How do they approach it?
Texts like The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis emphasize the profound peace that comes from having a good conscience. The Cloud of Unknowing speaks of the importance of purifying one's conscience through contemplative prayer. And John of Ruysbroek, a Flemish mystic, described 4 essential aspects of a true, well-formed conscience needed for a just.
It seems like across these different spiritual and philosophical traditions, there's this recurring theme. A clear conscience is linked to inner peace, to spiritual well-being.
Absolutely. Moving into the early modern period, you have Baruch Spinoza with his rationalist perspective. He defined conscience as the feeling of joy or sadness the mind experiences when reflecting on a past action it believes it performed freely.
Joy or sad. Interesting linkage to emotion.
Yeah. Hegel, in his complex system, saw conscience as the individual will of a morally good person in its unique expression. Joseph Butler, an influential British philosopher, strongly emphasized conscience as a principle of reflection that holds a natural authority over our passions and desires. Even John Selden offered a memorable analogy, comparing conscience to a king whose power should not be limited.
Those are some really powerful metaphors for the authority and importance of conscience in guiding our action. What about the thinkers of the Enlightenment, like Kant and Rousseau? They must have tackled this.
Oh, absolutely. Immanuel Kant, in perhaps his most famous statement on the subject, spoke of the awe he felt at the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me.
A classic line.
He viewed conscience as an internal court of justice, emphasizing that our primary motivation for virtuous acts should be duty, aligning with his famous categorical imperative.
Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Something like that.
Exactly. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, while differing in his overall philosophy, also saw conscience as something that connects us to a greater sense of unity and the common good. Plamonnats defined it more simply as a feeling urging us towards both internal harmony within ourselves and harmonious relationships in society.
That idea of an internal court in Kant's philosophy really highlights that self-regulatory aspect, and the emphasis on harmony in Rousseau and Plamonnats brings us back to that social dimension we talked about earlier.
Precisely. John Locke, a key figure in liberal thought, saw conscience as a potential justification for natural rights, but he raised the tricky question, does follow your conscience ultimately lead to subjective chaos or to objective morality?
Good question.
Thomas Hobbes, known for his more pragmatic, maybe cynical view of human nature, offered a cautionary note, pointing out that opinions based purely on conscience can often be erroneous or self-serving. William Godwin, an early anarchist thinker, saw conscience as a natural consequence of perceiving free will. Adam Smith.
The economics guy.
Yeah. Wealth of Nations' Adam Smith. He believed that a well-developed critical conscience helps us see ourselves and our actions from a more objective, balanced perspective. And John Stuart Mill, while a big proponent of individual liberty, cautioned against being overly idealistic about conscience and government, acknowledging the ever-present influence of self-interest.
It definitely seems like the Enlightenment brought a more critical, nuanced examination of conscience, exploring its links to rights, society, and the potential for error or bias.
Definitely. Josiah Royce, an American idealist, viewed conscience as the ideal of life requiring loyalty to our higher self. Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
The theologian who resisted the Nazis.
Yes. He saw conscience as something deeper than just practical reason, a direct call to unity with oneself. A guilty conscience, for him, indicated a loss of this inner unity. Joseph Soloveitchik, a prominent Jewish scholar, claimed that truth itself lives within individuals in the form of conscience.
Bonhoeffer's perspective, given his action, carries particular weight, doesn't it? And Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the Holocaust again, she also had profound insights about conscience and moral responsibility.
Yes. Arendt made the crucial point that having a bad conscience doesn't necessarily mean having a bad character. Often, it's those who have a commitment to some moral standard who experience the pangs of conscience when they violate.
That's a really interesting distinction.
And she offered that powerful analogy. Conscience as the anticipation of the fellow who awaits you when you return home, that inner voice of reflection and judgment. She also noted how many languages distinguish consciousness, being aware, from conscience. moral awareness, suggesting conscience is or should be a constant presence guiding our acts.
That idea of an inner reckoning, that fellow who awaits you, very evocative. And even scientific minds like Albert Einstein had reflections on conscience, didn't he?
Indeed. Einstein, a man of science and reason, spoke of an enlightened religious person being guided by a conscience reflecting what he called superpersonal thoughts, feelings, and aspirations. He often referred to this as an inner voice. Simone Weil, the philosopher and social activist, she argued for focusing on obligations over rights, believing a spiritual awakening of conscience was essential for a more just society. She also offered a psychological explanation for the deep mental peace that comes from a clear conscience.
So even for those with more scientific or secular worldviews, there often seems to be a recognition of a deeper, almost spiritual or universally human dimension to conscience.
Many thinkers have tried to bridge these seemingly disparate perspectives. Darwin, as we said, saw social instincts as the evolutionary foundation. Emile Durkheim, the sociologist, viewed soul and conscience as collective representations of an impersonal moral force in a group.
A collective force.
A.J. Ayer, a logical positivist, argued that statements about conscience weren't really facts, but expressions of emotion, an empirical question for sociology. G.E. Moore tried to reconcile idealistic and sociological, defining conscience as our awareness of abstract rightness, plus the accompanying.
It's truly fascinating how these different fields, philosophy, psychology, sociology, biology, all grapple with this fundamental human experience, each offering its own unique lens.
Exactly. Michael Walzer argued that religious toleration partly arose from recognizing an inner divine presence in private conscience, but cautioned against defining conscience as purely subjective belief without shared moral knowledge. Ronald Dworkin saw constitutional protection of conscience, creating personal duties of reflection. Edward Kanzi, a Buddhist scholar, suggested conscience expands through unselfish actions, while repressed compassion leads to unconscious guilt.
Okay.
And John Ralston Saul raised concerns about our modern tendency to turn over our critical conscience to technical experts or free market ideology.
That's a very relevant concern today, isn't it? The idea of passively accepting external frameworks instead of actively engaging our own inner moral compass.
Precisely. Many argue acting against one's own conscience is inherently blameworthy, even if that conscience is objectively wrong or erroneous. But there's also the danger of conscience being manipulated or needing external altruistic justification, as William Langston explores in Virtue Ethic, and Emmanuel Levinas, a key 20th century philosopher. He viewed conscience as a revelatory encounter with the other, with resistance to our selfish impulses. For him, welcoming the other is the essence of conscience.
Wow, that's a profound thought, conscience as fundamentally relational. So from a personal guide to a societal force shaping our interactions, it plays so many roles. Let's now turn our attention more directly to its influence on law and the broader structures of society.
Okay, well, back in the 16th and 17th centuries, English humanist lawyers interpreted conscience as a set of universal principles applicable through reason, and this significantly influenced legal reform. Even today, we see the conscience vote in Parliament.
Right, where politicians vote their beliefs, not the party line.
Exactly, on certain issues. However, the limitations of just following orders versus adhering to conscience were starkly highlighted during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. His defense of merely following legal orders was rejected by the Nuremberg Principles, establishing individual accountability for crimes against humanity, even under orders.
Underscoring the potential primacy of individual conscience over potentially immoral state directive. That tension between legal obligation and moral conviction is critical, especially when looking at history. And international law also recognizes conscience, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Articles 1 and 18 of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights and Article 18.1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights explicitly protect freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. It's argued these provide a basis for protecting conscientious objectors.
Conscientious objectors, people who refuse military service based on belief.
Right. Individuals who refuse to participate in military service or other actions violating their deeply held moral or religious beliefs.
So the right to refuse something that fundamentally clashes with one's inner moral code is recognized as a basic human right internationally. And the history of conscientious objection goes back quite a ways.
Oh, indeed. Think of Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. Very influential. The way Britain treated objectors in WWI was quite harsh, but different by WWI, showing a growing societal understanding. Organizations like Amnesty International continue to work for prisoners of conscience.
Prisoners of conscience, people jailed for their beliefs.
Exactly. And we also see conscience clauses in legislation, especially in healthcare, allowing professionals to opt out of procedures they morally object to. People object for various reasons: religious pacifism, humanitarian concerns, opposition to specific Pacific Wars, or conscription itself. Their main aim usually isn't to defy the law, but to uphold a higher moral imperative.
It's about prioritizing a personal moral code, even when it conflicts with legal or societal expectations. John Dewey suggested objectors sometimes have a kind of moral innocency, but stressed connecting conscience with the rule of law.
It's a delicate balance. Samuel Johnson, way back in the 18th century, cautioned against conscience leading to unjust suffering for others. He stressed needing thorough knowledge before conscience can determine moral action, and importantly, that no one's conscience can determine the right of another.
That's a crucial point. Your conscience guide and context matters, right? Even Einstein, a committed pacifist in WWI, later supported a world army against Nazi rearmament.
Right, showing how deeply held beliefs can be influenced by extreme circumstances. And history is filled with examples of individuals acting against laws or norms based on conscience, often at tremendous personal cost.
Who comes to mind?
Well, people like Chiun Sugihara, the Japanese diplomat, and Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish one, who defied orders during the Holocaust to save thousands of Jewish lives. Ho Fengshan in Vienna did similar things. John Rabe in Nanjing protected Chinese civilians. The White Rose student movement in Nazi Germany resisted based on moral conviction.
Incredible bravery.
In states with severe repression, conscientious noncompliance might be the only moral option. Sadly, the Milgram experiment showed how difficult resisting authority can be for many, even when it clashes with their inner sense of right and wrong.
Those acts of courage in the face of cruelty are truly inspiring. A testament to individual conscience-challenging oppressive system. Now let's broaden our scope. What about this idea of a world conscience? What does that entail?
It's rooted in a universalist perspective. The idea is that with global communication, humanity can move beyond traditional boundaries, national, cultural, ethnic, to develop a shared ethical framework based on universal values.
A global ethic.
Kind of. It often draws from spiritual or natural law, seeing conscience as part of a broader universal consciousness, though not necessarily tied to fundamentalist ideology. You see it reflected in groups like the Global Eco-Village Network or international conservation organizations advocating for global environmental stewardship.
So a vision of a shared global sense of right and wrong, driving collective action. But what are the obstacles? It sounds difficult.
Very difficult. Garrett Hardin's famous essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, is a major challenge.
The idea that shared resources get depleted because everyone acts in their self-interest.
Yeah, exactly. Hardin argued that individual self-interest often outweighs collective responsibility, making it hard for conscience alone to ensure sustainable management. He was skeptical about conscience solving global justice or sustainability. As resources become scarcer, the pressure to exploit common heritage areas intensifies, threatening the development of a world conscience.
A very real challenge, individual needs versus the planet's long-term health. Are there other reasons why a unified world conscience is so hard to achieve?
Well, Noam Chomsky argues that dominant free market ideology focusing on profit and consumerism actively work against it by prioritizing individual gain over collective responsibility, shaping us into passive consumers, not active.
Interesting critique.
On a slightly different note, John Passmore suggested true moral progress requires conscience to keep us anxious and dissatisfied with the status quo, constantly pushing us forward, not letting us get complacent. Organizations like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee on Conscience remind us of failures and work to prevent genocide.
So it's not just overcoming self-interest, but resisting ideologies and maintaining moral urgency globally.
Exactly. Oscar Arias Sanchez called the vast spending on arms a profound failure of global conscience. Nancy Pelosi challenged the world's conscience regarding Tibet. Nelson Mandela's life is often seen as shaping world conscience. The Right Livelihood Award honors conscience-driven contributions, and groups like Evaz use online platforms for massive conscience-driven activism.
So while the ideal faces obstacles, it remains a powerful aspiration for many working towards a better future. Now let's bring it back to individual actions. Can we look at some specific, notable examples of modern acts driven by conscience?
Sure. There's a wide spectrum. Think of Brenda Heen protesting the flooding of Lake Pedder in Australia, or Ken Saro-Wiwa executed for activism against oil extraction in Nigeria, both driven by environmental conscience. The image of the tank man in Tiananmen Square is an enduring symbol of individual courage. Dag Hammarskjöld's peace efforts in the Congo, Hugh Thompson Jr. stopping the My Lai massacre, Vasily Arkhipov preventing potential nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, all guided by conscience in critical moments.
Life or death moments.
Sometimes, yes. Even Evan Pedrick's Kubrick's confession to the Sydney Hilton bombing decades later seems motivated by a long-burdened conscience. And Thich Quang Duc's self-immolation was a dramatic protest against religious persecution.
Incredibly powerful, often selfless act. And conscience is vital for whistleblowers too, right?
Absolutely. Stephen Bolson exposing high mortality rates at Bristol Royal Infirmary, Jeffrey Wiggin revealing Big Tobacco's deceptions, David Graham raising safety concerns about Vioxx, Rick Piltz blowing the whistle on altered climate change reports.
Putting their careers, maybe more, on the line.
Often, yes. Even Muntatar Zaidi throwing shoes at President Bush. Controversial, but seen by some as an expression of conscience. Mordechai Vanunu revealing Israel's nuclear program, W. Mark Felt being deep-throat in Watergate. Both acted on what they saw as a higher moral imperative. Peter Buxton exposed the unethical Tuskegee experiment. Aung San Suu Kyi's refusal to leave Burma was a powerful stand.
These examples really underscore the personal risks involved in acting on conscience, often leading to major repercussions.
Indeed. Peter Galbraith criticized Afghan election fraud. Bunnateen Greenhouse exposed Halliburton irregularity. Journalists like Nagiat Lali, Anna Politkovskaya, Marie Colvin paid the ultimate price for reporting based on their commitment to truth. Human rights activists like Natalia Estemirova, Shireen Ebadi, Gao Zisheng faced immense.
It's humbling.
Even less globally dramatic acts matter. Laura Whittle rescuing refugees at sea, the protests against the Delhi gang rape, Malala Yousafzai's advocacy for female education after being shot, Edward Snowden's NSA revelation, all represent individuals and movements driven by a powerful...
It's a powerful reminder that conscience manifests in countless ways, big and small, public and private, acts of resistance and speaking truth to power. Now let's explore how this complex concept has been portrayed and examined in literature, art, film, and music.
The arts have long been a mirror for humanity's inner struggles with conscience. In the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata, both Arjuna's moral dilemma on the battlefield and Yudhishthira's refusal of heaven on moral grounds are pivotal moments driven by conscience.
Foundational stories.
Right. Montaigne, in his essays, reflected on the benefits of a clear conscience. Matsuo Bosch's travel journal shows his conscience moved by remnants of past life. Chaucer's Franklin's Tale illustrates conscience shaping truthfulness and generosity.
Great works of literature often delve into these fundamental questions, don't they? What about Shakespeare? Hamlet's struggles are legendary.
Oh, absolutely. The critic A.C. Bradley analyzed Hamlet's conflict as a clash between a traditional conscience, revenge, and a critical conscience grappling with the moral implications. Even Shakespeare's Sonnet 94 and John Donne's poem Good Friday, 1613, writing westward, reflect deeply on conscience.
So literature provides this incredible depth, letting us grapple vicariously. And it's not just Western lit, is it?
Not at all. Anton Chekhov's plays and stories often feature characters tormented by conscience and how easily it can be misunderstood or rationalized away. Chekhov's own trip to the Sakhalin penal colony was driven by social conscience.
Wow.
The Russian literary tradition, as Irina Ratushinskaya noted, focuses intensely on conscience. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is maybe the ultimate literary exploration of a guilt-ridden conscience as Raskolnikov wrestles with his actions. Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha shows a life following inner conscience to find truth. And in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Frodo's pure conscience is essential to his quest.
Such powerful narratives getting to the heart of the human struggle with right and wrong. What about more contemporary literature and film?
Connor Cruz O'Brien saw Albert Camus as representing the 20th century Western conscience. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird gives us Atticus Finch, a powerful example of moral conscience. Robert Bolt's play, A Man for All Seasons, brilliantly portrays Thomas More's loyalty to conscience against political pressure. George Orwell's 1984 chillingly depicts Winston Smith trying to maintain critical conscience in a totalitarian state. Picasso's Guernica tapestry at the UN is a constant spur to conscience. Even Van Gogh wrote about the importance of the fire in one's soul and the clear voice of conscience.
So art reflects, but also potentially catalyzes our own consciences. And film has explored these themes compellingly too, hasn't it?
Definitely. Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal has the knight's final altruistic act of conscience. Casablanca famously shows Rick Blaine's moral awakening. Dr. Zhivago explores an artist's conscience amid revolution. Even sci-fi like Blade Runner asks profound questions about what constitutes conscience, blurring lines between humans and reptiles.
Fascinating how film uses visual storytelling for these internal concepts. And music, too, can evoke a powerful sense of conscience and morality.
Indeed. Bach's Mass in B minor is often heard as expressing emotions from conscience reflecting on life and death. Beethoven's String Quartet Op. 132 has that deeply moving third movement, the Holy Song of Thanksgiving, linked to conscience and mortality.
Beautiful.
John Lennon's Imagine can be heard as an appeal to global conscience against war and injustice. George Harrison's The Inner Light sets the Tao Te Ching to music, exploring inner wisdom. Ennio Morricone's score for The Mission powerfully underscores guilt, redemption, and the struggle of conscience.
The music is unforgettable there.
Even more contemporary tracks, like Deep Forest's Sweet Lullaby, based on a Solomon Islands lullaby, speak to brotherly conscience, and the Dream Academy's Forest Fire serves as a warning against moral apathy.
It's truly incredible to see how this fundamental concept of conscience resonates across so many different fields, from ancient religious texts to cutting-edge science, from philosophy to art and music.
It really is. And as we've explored, conscience functions as, well, a personal guide, a societal force, a legal principle, and a deeply compelling subject for artistic exploration. We hope that you, our listener, have had some of those aha moments as we've journeyed perspective.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final reflection for you. Considering all the different ways we've seen conscience defined and understood, divine spark, evolutionary adaptation, intuition, rational thought, personal conviction, global ethic, what does your own inner voice tell you about the origin and authority of your conscience? Is it a fixed moral compass, something innate, or is it something that evolves and changes throughout your life, shaped by experience, learning, and the world around you?
Yeah, that's a crucial question for each of us to consider the nature and source of our own moral compass. We really encourage you to continue exploring the rich array of thinkers, ideas, and artistic expressions we've touched upon in this deep dive. This has just been a starting point, really, for a lifelong exploration into this fundamental aspect of being human.
Exactly. The journey to understand our own conscience and the role it plays in our lives and in the world. Thanks so much for joining us.